They would gather in the parlor at 5:30 for cocktails, the men enjoying imported brandy while the ladies sipped delicate cordials. Conversation would flow over topics ranging from plantation business to New Orleans gossip, with the children expected to listen respectfully to their elders. At precisely 6 o'clock, old Moses would announce that supper was served, and the family would process into the dining room with the ceremony of a religious procession. Octave always sat at the head of the table, with Celeste at the opposite end. The children and extended family members took their assigned seats according to a hierarchy that had been established years ago and never varied. Grandmère Beauregard, despite her advanced age, maintained her position of honor at Octave's right hand, while Auguste sat to his left. The conversation during these meals was carefully orchestrated, with each family member understanding their role in maintaining the image of harmonious prosperity. But beneath the surface of this carefully constructed domestic tranquility, tensions simmered like a pot ready to boil over. The spring of 1847 had brought unusual stress to the Beauregard household. The sugar crop had been poor the previous year due to flooding, and creditors were beginning to make uncomfortable inquiries about outstanding debts. Octave had been forced to sell several pieces of property and was considering the unthinkable option of selling some of his slaves to raise capital. These financial pressures had made Octave even more volatile than usual. His temper, which had never been pleasant, had become explosive and unpredictable. The enslaved people of the household learned to read the warning signs. The way his jaw would clench when reviewing ledgers, the sharp tone he would use when giving orders, and most dangerously, the way his eyes would grow cold and calculating when he was planning some new cruelty. It was during this period of mounting tension that Violet's relationship with Samuel began to deepen into something that could no longer be hidden or ignored. The catalyst for the tragedy that would unfold came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late June 1847, when the Louisiana heat seemed to press down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket. Violet was in the kitchen preparing for a dinner party the Beauregards were hosting for visiting Charleston plantation owners, carefully arranging canapes, when she heard Samuel's voice from the courtyard, raised in what sounded like distress. She rushed to the kitchen window and saw a scene that would forever change the course of her life. Samuel was on his knees in the dusty courtyard, his shirt torn and bloody, while Octave stood over him with a leather whip in his hand. The master's face was twisted with rage, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed accusations. "You dare look at my daughter with those eyes?" Octave's voice carried clearly through the humid air. "You forget your place, boy." Violet's blood turned to ice as she realized what had happened. Margot, Octave's 17-year-old daughter, had been spending more time in the stables recently, and Violet had noticed the way the girl's cheeks would flush whenever Samuel was nearby. She had also seen Samuel's discomfort at this unwanted attention, his careful attempts to avoid being alone with any of the white women in the household. But in the twisted logic of plantation life, a slave's discomfort at unwanted attention was interpreted as presumption, and presumption was a crime punishable by death. "Please, Master Beauregard," Samuel gasped between blows. I would never." "Silence." Octave's whip cracked again, leaving another bloody stripe across Samuel's back. "Your silence is guilt enough." But it was what happened next that sealed everyone's fate. As Octave raised his arm for another blow, Violet couldn't contain herself any longer. She burst from the kitchen door and threw herself between the whip and Samuel's bleeding back. "Please, Master Octave," she cried. "Samuel done nothing wrong. He's a good man. He works hard. The words died in her throat as Octave's face turned toward her, his expression shifting from rage to something far more dangerous, cold, calculating fury. The other slaves in the courtyard seemed to shrink back into the shadows, sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. "So," Octave said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his previous shouting, "the cook thinks she can tell me how to discipline my property." Violet's knees began to shake, but she didn't move from her position shielding Samuel. "No, Master, You just what? Octave stepped closer, so close she could smell the brandy on his breath and see the network of broken blood vessels in his eyes. You just think you can interfere with your betters? You think because you can cook a decent meal, you have the right to question my judgment? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Samuel's labored breathing and the distant call of a mockingbird from somewhere in the garden. Violet knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. But as she looked down at Samuel's bleeding form, she realized she didn't care. "Samuel is a good man," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "He ain't done nothing to deserve this." Octave's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "A good man? He's property, girl. My property. And so are you." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I think you've forgotten that, haven't you? I think you've gotten ideas above your station." What followed was a punishment that went far beyond physical pain. Octave ordered Samuel to be locked in the stable's tack room with no food or water, declaring that he would remain there until he learned proper respect. But for Violet, he devised something far more cruel. "From now on," he announced to the assembled household, "Violet will prepare all meals as usual. But she will not eat until every member of this family has declared themselves satisfied with her work. And since I am very difficult to satisfy," he let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. The next 3 days were a nightmare beyond description. Violet continued to prepare elaborate meals for the family while subsisting on nothing but water and the occasional scrap that old Moses or Lily could sneak to her when no one was watching. Her hands shook as she kneaded bread, her vision blurred as she stirred sauces, and her legs could barely support her weight as she carried heavy platters to the dining room. But worse than her physical suffering was the psychological torture Octave inflicted. He would find fault with every dish. The soup was too salty, the meat too tough, the vegetables overcooked, and each criticism meant another day without food. He took visible pleasure in describing the flavors and textures of each dish while she stood in the corner of the dining room, forced to watch him eat the food she had prepared but could not taste. On the second day of her punishment, Samuel managed to escape from the tack room, driven by desperation and concern for Violet. He made it as far as the kitchen before Octave's men caught him. The beating that followed was savage enough that Dr. Thibodeau had to be called to ensure Samuel wouldn't die before Octave was finished with him. It was while tending to Samuel's wounds that Dr. Thibodeau made an observation that would prove crucial to understanding what followed. As he cleaned Samuel's injuries, he noticed that Violet was hovering nearby, her face gaunt from hunger, but her eyes burning with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "That girl," he told his wife later that evening, "has the look of someone who has been pushed past the breaking point. I've seen it before in slaves who have been driven too far. It's a dangerous look, Doctor." Thibodeau was a man who understood the delicate balance that held plantation society together. Born into a family of modest means, he had worked his way up to become one of New Orleans' most respected physicians, serving both the wealthy plantation families and, when his conscience demanded it, providing secret medical care to slaves whose masters would rather let them die than pay for treatment. He had seen enough cruelty over the years to understand its effects on the human soul. He knew that most people, when pushed beyond their limits, would simply break. They would become hollow shells, going through the motions of life without really living. But some, a dangerous few, would transform their suffering into something harder and more focused. These were the ones who would smile while planning revenge, who would wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. As he looked at Violet that day, tending to Samuel's wounds with hands that should have been trembling with exhaustion, but were instead steady with purpose, Dr. Thibodeau recognized the signs. He made a mental note to warn Octave that his cruelty was creating a dangerous situation. But like many such good intentions, it was something he kept meaning to do until it was too late. On the third day of her punishment, something inside Violet died, and something else was born. As she stood in the dining room watching Octave savor a piece of her famous praline bread pudding, describing its flavors with theatrical enthusiasm while she swayed on her feet from hunger, a cold clarity settled over her mind like fog rolling in from the Mississippi. She began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way Octave's hand shook slightly when he was nervous,